This video is about the big issue of poverty and wealth in A Christmas Carol. It starts by considering how you might answer a question, how you might approach an extract that's to do with poverty or wealth, and then moves through how the theme is developed in the rest of the book. So to start with, here is an example question. It uses an extract that comes from stave 4, where the city gentlemen are discussing what turns out to be the death of Scrooge, and of course therefore shows probably the example of the wealthiest people and probably the most disgustingly wealthy people. So if we look at the extract first of all, how this description is used to show the view of the wealthy, we see that it starts at the beginning with a description of Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas yet to come coming to the City of London. Now, at this point, it's well worth being aware that as this is an extract from a book you are expected to have read and worked on, you would be expected to know things such as the city means the City of London, and therefore the place, not just the actual city itself, but the place where most wealth transactions take place. And this will become true later on when snuff is mentioned. They'd expect you to know that, and what a pendulous excrescence is as well. So it's important to know that you need to be prepared on these first. So the first thing I will pick out in this extract is this opening line. Now, a reminder once again that the biggest problem you're likely to come across in dealing with extracts is looking at what rather than how. Looking at the events, the things that happen in the extract, rather than looking at the way that Dickens is writing. Now, this first sentence is a good example of the way Dickens is writing, because not only does it tell us that they arrive at the city, but it gives us a sense of what the city is like from the way he describes it. Focus in on these verbs, which bring about, well, it's a kind of personification of the city, but probably more it's a kind of a metaphor that portrays it almost as something monstrous attacking them, springing up around them, encompassing them, springing up quite an aggressive action, encompassing them. Again, no escape, the sense there's no escape from it. So immediately setting up this place that represents the wealthy as something threatening and aggressive. Next, move on to the next paragraph, which again, still dealing with the description of the city, really works here upon all the different merchants who are around, who are at the heart of the city. First of all, I'd notice that this is a list. Now, we know from reading that Dickens likes to list, therefore piling ideas on top of ideas. And this is what he does here in the behaviour and attitudes of the merchants. And I picked out 3 things from the list: that the merchants are chinking money in their pockets, looking at their watches, and trifling thoughtfully with their great gold seals. Now, what we have is 2 examples here of them physically playing around with things to do with money, as though that's what matters to them, as though feeling for it. So their actual attachment is to the physical idea of money. And attached to that, of course, is looking at their watches, looking at time. So time and money seem to be what's significant to them. And I might focus in is trifling thoughtfully, the idea that they're playing around casually with these gold seals, but with a lot of thought in their mind at the same time. So thinking about money is what I'd come out with. So far, we've got the city as a kind of aggressive place. We've got the sense that the people in it are purely obsessed with money and feeling and playing with money and how that relates to time. Move on to the rest of the extract, which is all about this little knot of businessmen, as they say, having a discussion about Scrooge's death. But what I notice here, and what I've highlighted at this point, is how they are described as revolting, really unpleasant to see, to look at, to witness what they're doing. And of course, that attaches itself to what wealth makes you if you are not generous with it, if you are obsessed with it, as we've just seen with those merchants before. So here we have a great fat man with a monstrous chin. And of course, the size of him, the fatness of him, that, in this society where there's so much poverty around, size represents wealth. And so the huge fatness of this man represents just how wealthy he is. We have the other one taking some snuff out of a large snuff box. And again, as we said before, you should know what snuff is. But it's quite an unpleasant image, this taking out of this kind of snuff tobacco stuff and shoving it up, ready to shove up his nose in front of everybody. And then finally, the worst one of all, this one with a thing hanging off the end of his nose and dangling and shaking around, looking quite ridiculous. Now, so as well as showing that Dickens is describing them as revolting, I would also focus in on how he is exaggerating that, how he's using hyperbole. Certain key words here. Look at these adjectives. Quite unnecessary, but they exaggerate it to almost the level of being a caricature, not a real character, but an exaggerated picture of somebody. Great fat, monstrous chin, vast quantity of snuff, a very large snuff box. It's quite deliberately exaggerating. And then, of course, that last description is exaggerated in itself, having this excrescence pendulous swinging from side to side, shaking like the gills of a turkey cock off the end of his nose. I'd possibly then move on to the idea of the yawn that comes in as well. Remember, they're talking here about Scrooge's death. What was the matter with him? God knows. And he yawns as though it's of so little consequence to them. So from my point of view, pulling this apart, I've got two parts to this answer. First of all, the city and the people in it being described and their attitude coming across. And secondly, this particular group and how revolting they are. Now, to practice how this works, have a look at this. This comes immediately after this. So it is actually pretty much juxtaposed with the scene that we've just looked at. It is the introduction to Old Joe and his horrible shop in one of, as it says, one of the horriblest areas of town, one of the most appalling areas of town. Have a look at this and try what we just did, but try it yourself. I can suggest you pause to give you a chance to do this, and then carry on playing after that. We will move on. Okay, so one of the mistakes that people make with literature, as I'm sure you're aware, is that they think that the assessment objective that brings in context requires them to know a lot of background information and repeat it about the time in which this is written. Now, this is of course not true. This is not history. This is English, and the only context you need is in the text itself, as in you can work it out from reading the book. So if we're looking at the situation for the poor in the mid-19th century, we don't need to have read lots of books and researched things, because first of all, we'll probably be wrong. What we can do is take evidence from this book which will help us understand what he's trying to say about the poverty. For example, we can work out that there was very poor sanitation and disease was being spread, and we can work this out from what we've just read. The area around Joe's shop tells us very clearly, with the piles of offal in the corner, the fact he doesn't even have a proper front to his shop, and the area around it. We can also work out that there's high child mortality. We don't need to know that. We can see that from the fact that Tiny Tim is so fragile and dies. We can see there is no state provision for the sick or poor, just charities, from the way that the two portly gentlemen have to go around collecting for the poor. Now, again, all of these areas are only really important to us if they answer the question. If we're looking at what he's trying to say about poverty, we might point out he uses these people to show us the poor state for them. We get a similar situation with the atmosphere around it as well, the smog that comes around due to coal. And we get that from the description of how the fog is invading everywhere. Remember, it at times even begins to invade the house. This is fog beyond what we know. So any of those could be helpful for us. And when we begin to look in more detail at the individual staves, we can see how poverty and wealth is being portrayed there. When you look at the initial description of Scrooge at the beginning, you'll see it's a very clear portrayal of wealth, and pretty much unnecessary wealth. This description of him physically representing somebody who is unwelcoming and unpleasant. We then get, soon after that, the two portly gentlemen who show us a different picture of wealth. They are clearly wealthy. The word portly is there to again suggest that they are living very nicely, very well. But when they turn up, they are devoting their time to actually use Christmas to help other people. It's very important to see that throughout the book, Dickens is not attacking wealth. Well, I don't think he is anyway, that's my opinion. He's not attacking the wealthy. He seems to be attacking wealthy people who do not use their money, who are not generous. Soon after the two portly gentlemen, we get the carol singer, described as somebody really, really poor, out on the streets, really struggling, singing to earn a little bit of money, and Scrooge goes to attack him physically with a ruler. And probably most significantly in stave one is Scrooge's house itself. Probably the best use you can find of wealth, I would say, certainly. Scrooge's house, remember, is huge, far too big just for him. But he also doesn't really use most of it. He only uses a couple of rooms. We're seeing there. He doesn't light it. He keeps it dark. He eats by a very small fire to keep himself warm. And basically, the whole place is an example of a man with money who won't spend it. This idea of the miser that we've come to associate with Scrooge. When the ghosts arrive, the chains are a good metaphor for what wealth is and what it suggests. It weighs you down. It is something that restricts you rather than give you the freedom that you think. Move to staves 2 and 3. Obviously, stave 2 is far more focused around Scrooge and Scrooge's character. So it's less of a focus there, but we do get Fezziwig, who is obviously a direct comparison with Scrooge. They are both employers, both successful and making their money. But what we see is two different Christmas Eves. We see Scrooge in his cold, go-on-in place being rude and unpleasant to all visitors, and on the other hand we see Fezziwig celebrating Christmas, described as warm and light, the place that he's in, and of course he welcomes in everybody. Quite the contrast, and showing us what you can be with wealth. When we get Belle in stave 2, obviously one of the big issues with Belle and her breaking off the engagement with Scrooge is the idea that money has taken him over. So there's one idea there, that it gets in the way of love. But we also see her family afterwards, and she's clearly pretty well off in the fact she's got plenty of children. They're all comfortable and happily looked after. They all have their toys and everything. So again, it suggests she was able, her and her husband, to acquire wealth without having to be like Scrooge. Probably the best example from this section for me is at the beginning of stave 3, where it's the first thing that the Ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge out to look at, the people around on the streets. And there we get different types of people all out shopping, smoothing away snow from their houses. And the people who are pushing away snow from their houses, particularly, it's described as quite an unpleasant area, quite a dank and dark and not particularly nice area, but it's Christmas, and so people who are not particularly wealthy are enjoying themselves, start throwing snowballs at each other. Others out shopping, might be out spending money and, you know, looking at what these days we might see as the materialist side of Christmas, but they're happy, and a little sprinkling of the magic powder from the ghost makes any dispute go away. So again, an example there of how poor and more wealthy people can have this Christmas spirit and can use this to get on and be around together. The Cratchits represent a different type of poverty. They're not, in the lowest form of poverty like Old Joe and people that will come to, but they really struggle to get by. And that whole situation of their Christmas, quite a lengthy bit, is there, I think, really to show us that people who are poor can make the best of it. Don't miss the miners who come in after them. Much poorer, much harsher life that they go out to see. But again, people who in their poverty are using family once again as the basis of their lives to be happy. And at the end of stave 3, we get ignorance and want. And again, that quite clearly, I mean, that really is a passage in which I certainly feel that Dickens is almost taking a step aside from the story, just to kind of preach at us and say to us, this is what will happen if you let poverty go unchecked, to his middle class audience. Two staves. We've just seen the city and the poor that contrasts with it, the very, very poor in Old Joe's. And what I'd say about those two is that in the city extract, the people are described as physically monstrous in amongst a lot of wealth. In the poor, they're not described as physically monstrous. The area is. So you get the contrast. The areas are very different. And that kind of puts the blame on society. And the suggestion that the people aren't necessarily monstrous until wealth corrupts them. Now, I know they are involved in morally dubious things, in stealing from dead bodies and whatever, but when we look at that section, I think really, in that environment, we can understand it and maybe just be horrified that people are reduced to that. Don't forget the mortgaged couple after that, who are struggling with their repayments, who are presented very sympathetically, but Scrooge is bleeding them dry and bringing them to bankruptcy, to the point that they're almost happy at his death. Again, corruption of wealth and misuse of wealth there, and the way it forces people towards poverty. And then in stave 5, we get the contrasting generosity. The biggest turkey in the shop, he sends down to the Cratchits, and we can see from within there that the Cratchits had goose before, and then he sends turkey. Clearly, turkey is the luxury item. So he spreads his wealth there. The fact that we come back to the two portly gentlemen, and he comes round to their way of thinking and offers them money that surprises them, shocks even them how much it is. And then the fact that he chooses to end by raising Bob's money. So it's all about him becoming generous. And I think in the end, that's what we have to say about poverty and wealth. Generosity goes across both of them. So, having gone through all of that, here's an example question that you can attempt yourself. Think about how we began, what we did to look at extracts, and then think about how that might relate to some of the ideas in the rest of the book. I'll leave you with this.